Hello and welcome to Enterprise Tech Spotlight. My name is Keith Hales with InfoSystems, and thank you for joining us today. Today we are actually going to finish part 2 of our modern infrastructure topic that Robert and I started on the last podcast series, our last podcast we released. So Robert is our CTO here at InfoSystems and has graciously agreed to join us for these first few podcasts we're making. So Robert, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate that.
So what I want to do right now is continue the conversation that we were having on our previous podcast around specifically modern infrastructure. And just to recap for those that may not have listened, or if it's been a while since you've listened to that one, we talked about that there are different types of ways to provide infrastructure for businesses. There's traditional infrastructure with servers and SANs and switches and firewalls and just kind of a traditional network that most people in IT are familiar with. There's obviously cloud infrastructure with like a Microsoft Azure or an Amazon Web Services, or Google Cloud, a GCP solution. There's hyper-converged infrastructure like a VxRail or a Nutanix, which is taking, it's kind of meeting between the two from a technology stack perspective and kind of simplifying the technology stack, but still on-premise ultimately and not in somebody else's data center in the cloud. Right. And then we have hybrid, which is where an organization is leveraging two or multiple of those different solutions to meet their needs. So we talked a little bit about the technology side of the house last time, which was very interesting and certainly educational for those that haven't experienced that or are still trying to figure it out right now. What I want to talk today mostly about is the business side of that conversation, right? So I do think that we can talk about the cost benefit side of some of these different solutions and maybe even what we've seen in our customers and what they think might be more expensive, what they think might be less expensive versus reality once they get into it. So just following the same pattern we followed last time, from a cost of acquisition and management, let's talk about those two areas of traditional infrastructure. If we look at, let's say, a 4-year term, that seems to be kind of a good horizon for most businesses. If they're looking at infrastructure, 4 years is probably a good average of what we see amongst our customers. So over a 4-year term, let's look at a traditional infrastructure. Let's say an organization, they want an on-prem environment in their actual physical facility, and then they have a secondary DR environment that's maybe a third-party data center, but it's their own equipment. But they buy SAN, they buy multiple servers, they're running their own backups, they're patching all those. So let's talk about the pros and cons from a cost perspective on those.
Well, beyond the capital expenditure,
yeah,
right, that goes with that. So your administrative overhead, right? So the more complex environment, the more administrative time that is spent. So your soft cost there is increases, right?
So that soft cost, is that going to be personnel? Is that going to be outsourcing to a third party? What kind of soft costs are we talking about here?
Well, if it's managed on-prem, typically it's personnel,
mm-hmm.
right? Your 1, 2, 3, whatever size company you happen to be of your IT specialists, right? That are out there actually doing the patching, maintaining the systems, replacing failed equipment, all that kind of good stuff, right? The actual implementation, the server configurations, and just your day-to-day, like you said, the backups and monitoring and management of that stuff. That's where your soft cost is. And the more complex that environment is, the higher that cost is going to be. Right.
So what about the cost of acquisition?
Well, it depends on what you need, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because like all things, there's 1,000 ways to skin the cat. But typically your acquisition cost for traditional infrastructure is higher on the front side.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's where your TCO. What is my total cost of ownership? They project it, or we can help project it from year 1 through year 2, 3, and 4. Right, and some companies may even go to year 5. Right, depending on what return, whatever the finance guys say. Hey, you can spend X. Right, so but your initial cost of investment is higher on the front end mm-hmm. versus like a cloud environment. Right.
So so the initial cost is higher. Now, obviously, it could be purchased via just a capital outlay,
right.
a PO and an invoice, and somebody cuts a check. It could be leased equipment as well on-prem. But what we've seen is that compared to a cloud environment, the on-premise infrastructure is typically a lot less just for the acquisition cost of the servers and infrastructure versus somebody who's spinning up the similar size environment in AWS. from a cost perspective. Now there's management cost and considerations, and there's data center cost and considerations. But if we're talking about just the cost to purchase the operating system, to purchase the server, and to run it, it's typically cheaper running on-prem in a traditional environment.
From a month-to-month basis, keeping apples to apples, typically yes. Because here's one of the gotchas, right? Is on-premise traditional infrastructure, I don't have to worry about egress fees as I access data. And if you have a really chatty database, right, or an Oracle database or a SQL database, that's a lot of transactions. So if you're doing like retail or even manufacturing and you're doing a lot of access and reads, in a traditional environment, I don't have to worry about the additional costs as I would inside of a cloud environment, where I have to be very concerned about how that system is going to perform and act and what supplemental charges I'm going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but also at a business level, if I'm looking at an on-premise environment, I have to worry about staffing it. Now, whether I staff it with W-2 personnel or I find a partner like InfoSystems or other partners to patch and care and feed this environment, there is that higher operational cost that a cloud environment, transparently, you don't have to worry about all this stuff.
You don't. The cloud environment is less administrative overhead. You're right. It doesn't take the number of staff to manage a cloud environment that it does in a traditional infrastructure. It definitely takes more there than it does in the cloud.
Absolutely. And obviously those are different skills, so you can't take one and quickly plug them into the other side. Not that they couldn't be trained, but as far as the skills today versus skills tomorrow. It is.
It's cloud is definitely programmatic in nature. It takes a little bit of a different mindset to deal with that. So you're not just going to plug a network administrator, right? And again, you usually have specific skill sets within the traditional infrastructure. You got your network guy, you got your server guy, right? The cloud is more, you just have a cloud person that understands the concepts of all that. But since you're dealing in a virtual environment, essentially that's what a cloud is. You don't have to have those specific skill sets to the depth that they do.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and talk cloud.
Okay.
So let's talk cost there. So obviously, if I'm spinning up a cloud environment, my upfront cost might be zero or whatever the time that it takes for one of my people to go and spin up a cloud. I don't have to issue a PO and expect to pay thousands or tens of thousands or in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy this equipment. So that's a huge upside to the cloud.
It is a very attractive upside, and why a lot of people, especially as the cloud became prevalent over the last 5-6 years, is because they can get into compute very cheaply, very inexpensively. The gotcha is, as I mentioned before, you got to be careful of what systems you're sticking in there. From a production workload standpoint, getting in's easy, right? Getting your data up there is actually easy. Most hyperscalers don't charge you to put data in; they charge you to read data out. So or they charge you to read data laterally. There's another gotcha that most people may not be aware of. If I have server instances inside of a hyperscaler, and one happens to be a database and the other one's doing a whole lot of reads and writes back to that, you're getting dinged for that. That's cost.
So you're having to pay extra for applications that are talking to them within the same environment a lot, or even talking to a system that's outside of that environment a lot.
Especially, if you're doing a DR, right? Yeah. So a lot of people will do cloud as DR because if you're syncing it, that's a one-way
upload.
It's a one-way upload. Yes, technically there's a read back to make sure, but that's a minimal, right? So getting it in there is fine. But what people don't consider is what happens if I have to fail to the cloud, and this now becomes my production environment. Did they anticipate the cost of firing all that gear up? CPU time as it's on, right? Hyperscalers charge you for the CPU that's on, right? Additional to the read and write. So is that in the plan? Or is the CFO going to be knocking on the IT guy's door going, what did you just do? Right?
Yeah. So the pro of that also of being in the cloud is it sounds like you may not need as many different specialists to administer your cloud environment. So today, if you're an enterprise, you're probably going to have a storage guy, maybe two, at least one data center network guy who can do all the layer 3 switching and routing and all that other stuff. You're going to need probably a VMware administrator, a backup administrator. You're going to need all these different specialists. But if your data is in the cloud, since it's more programmatic, you may not need as many different specialists to administer that environment.
Typically, you don't. right? Whereas, to use your example, if you had, let's say, 5 people, highly specialized people, you could probably get away with 2, maybe 3, depending on the scale of the environment.
That are more generalist.
That are generalist. That, again, have the concepts and understandings, but maybe not as deep. That, you will have to understand at the network layer, routing, and so that's kind of a need, because if you think about cloud, it is 99% networking. Right, that's your biggest challenge in a cloud environment. Getting your compute and your storage and your applications up and running. That's the generalist type job. The network piece is really the one specialty you almost still have to keep, but it doesn't have to be in my opinion, it doesn't have to be nearly as deep as the data center guy who's dealing with all the layer 3, all the the routings and the NAT statements and all the stuff that goes with it. Okay.
So the other infrastructure that we talked about was the hyper-converged infrastructure. So this is going to be your VxRail, Nutanix, other technologies similarly. So help us understand pros and costs, upfront cost, long-term, ongoing administrative costs.
So upfront cost, like traditional infrastructure, because it is on-premise typically, there is a capital expenditure there. Usually it's not as expensive as you would think for traditional infrastructure, because it is a condensed platform, right? It's
so you're not buying as many components.
You're not having to buy as many components. It's due to the deep integration they have. It's not as difficult to handle that integration, right? So it's already built in, is what I'm trying to say. So you're not paying for larger components to handle the massive points of integration. So in an enterprise environment, your core network switch, as an example, you may have 1,000 ports on it, whereas in a hyper-converged infrastructure, that's already kind of taken care of.
Right.
So your initial acquisition cost is not as expensive. Again, either CapEx, they lease it or whatever. Not as cheap as cloud, but not as expensive as you would in traditional infrastructure.
Okay. But the ongoing cost is slightly less than the traditional infrastructure, because the management layer is just a lot easier.
It is a lot easier. Going back to that integration layer that they've got, it's usually a single interface. The administrator doesn't have to deal with how is the storage array laid out? What is the server compute performance going to be? What is my network stuff going to look like? Again, like cloud, you have to have some networking expertise to be able to get it to communicate to your business network, but you don't have to have that really. You don't have 5 guys managing this one environment.
So as far as the hyper-converged infrastructure solution goes, as long as it meets the business need, it sounds like it's a fairly good solution if you choose to go down the on-premise path because of that. Now, again, like I mentioned in our previous episode, it is what it is, and so it doesn't offer you the flexibility. So we have customers that they can't go down that path because of performance concerns, or they may have a specialized application that just won't run well on that environment for a variety of reasons. But for some, it's a great solution.
It is. I mean, if you have, they're great for point solutions, as you mentioned in our other episode. If all you needed to do is run this, the file print, share stuff, great. Or if you have a specific application, right, great. Just don't ask it to do a lot beyond as don't start adding on things, because your performance levels may not be where they need to be.
Or maybe said a different way, know what you plan to run on it before you purchase it.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the hybrid mode. So pros and cons of going hybrid. And I think this may even be kind of a moot point, because you and I both know almost every business out there is in some way hybrid today.
Correct.
So talking about the pros and cons to make a decision may not be applicable, but maybe talking about the pros and cons so people are aware of them, right? So in this environment, what are some things that people may not be aware of in a hybrid environment if they've been used to maybe a traditional environment, or if they've been used to born in the cloud and they, for application support reasons or cost savings reasons, they're starting to move to hybrid mode?
Well, so I'm going to go with the first one. Let's do traditional, and then you DR to the cloud, or you're moving production applications to the cloud because you want to, for whatever reason, again, app dev, test, whatever, right?
Right.
So taking the individuals that are used to managing a traditional infrastructure and then asking them to manage cloud infrastructure, can they do it? Sure. Is it going to be as easy and are they just going to just dive right into it? No, there's skill ramp up time. Well, there's, back to the business conversation, there's soft costs that go with that, because now I've got an engineer spending time to train to get to the level they can manage that environment additionally to this environment. So you're losing effective business cycles for training cycles.
Okay. So you've got a skill up problem.
Yeah, you do. You have a skill up problem. Conversely to that, the same problem exists if you're born on the cloud or you just, for whatever reasons, you started in the cloud and you're going to start to go to the traditional infrastructure or even a hyper-converged layer. You have to skill up to be able to manage those environments. So as soon as you break into a hybrid role, and most businesses today are at some layer, they've had to go through that pain. You have to get through that cost of doing business, of getting your team skilled to where they need to be. Right.
So with that in mind, is your experience that companies usually think through all these costs before they go down one of these paths?
Traditionally not.
And why is that?
The cloud's easy. Come on, Keith. Cloud's easy.
It is easy.
Yeah, anybody can just turn on the cloud.
I mean,
right?
You know that I'm not that technical, and I know how to get into the cloud.
Right.
So yeah.
I won't take the bait. But a lot of the reason is you're driven. My opinion is you're driven by hype. Right? Is that you get this decision? The business leaders have made a decision.
Somebody in the C-suite says, "This is what we're doing.
We're going to cloud, man.
Sure.
We're all in. We're doing cloud because that's the buzzword of the day."
Sure.
Nobody really considered, do we have the skills to do it? What's it going to take to get there? What's it going to take to operate in there?
How much is it going to cost on a month-to-month basis?
How much is it going to cost on a month-to-month basis as soon as we turn that on? And then a lot of times you get what I call the shock factor is through the first month and second month, oh yeah, okay, it's fine because as you're implementing and doing things.
Because they're slowly adding things in. Right?
Usually about 6 months in, the finance department starts to lose their mind because they're wanting to know why we're spending more than 2x the cost to operate in this environment when it costs way less to do it in an on-prem solution.
Right.
So there's arguments to be made that the same thing can happen the other way.
Absolutely.
Right. But typically speaking, that's what we see is a lot of people are starting to pull back out of the cloud and living in this true hybrid environment.
Yeah, and what we would encourage anyone listening is to not necessarily try to stick with one or the other, but to be well thought out on which applications that you should run in the cloud versus which ones you should run locally. I think that's going to be the key
element.
Right there.
That is the key element. Understanding your workload and where it belongs appropriately, because there are workloads that don't need to be in an on-prem solution. They operate better in a cloud environment. Again, test dev, research and development, all these kind of things. Those belong up there because you can control that cost layer better than just having it sit idle on some CPUs that you get laid a CapEx cost out on, right? But you have to be careful. Key, what is the application going to do? How's it going to operate? What is the compliance needs? What are the performance needs? A lot of thought needs to go into the process before you go one way or the other.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Well, we made this a 2-part series, so we give ourselves plenty of time. But unfortunately, we've run out of time again.
Oh, man.
But that's okay. So this has been a great podcast to record with you, Robert. Really appreciate it. So we hope everybody enjoyed the 2-part series on modern infrastructure. And we hope that you can join us for our next episode. Thanks a lot.